tap your toe and to think a little bit about the text that I read. And I've got a confession to make that, for many, many years, every time I read this text in Corinthians, I would just kind of laugh to myself and chuckle. It's like, yeah, right. That the church is going to be of a single mind and have, no division among them. And it just didn't seem all that likely. As a matter of fact, it kind of reminded me of one of my very favorite stories. Now, if I have told you this, I apologize, but it bears repeating because it is such a good story. The story goes something like this. There was a man that was stranded on a deserted island. For a couple of years he was there, and he finally got the attention of a passing naval vessel that was out in the water. He had a signal fire going, and the naval vessel realized that this island should not be inhabited, and so they sent a helicopter over to kind of check things out. And the helicopter then found the man that had been stranded there and rescued him. And they both got into the helicopter and they were lifting off. And the pilot noticed these 3 huts that the man had built along the shoreline and on the beach. And he thought that it was odd that there were 3, and so he questioned the man a little bit, and he asked him about the hut in the middle, the one that had the fabric hanging there and everything, and he said, what's that hut? Why did you build that? And the man responded, he said, well, that was my house. That's where I lived. And the pilot kind of nodded and said, well, yeah, okay, I understand that. Then what's the hut there on the left? What was that? The man said, well, that was my church. I wanted a special place where I could go and pray and all of that. And so I built a church. And the pilot nodded and said, oh, that's great. That's really nice. What about the hut on the far right? What was that one? And the man kind of scoffed and he shook his head and he waved his hands. He said, that's the church I used to go to. Like I said, it's one of my favorite stories. But that's kind of the attitude that I had when I read this text in Corinthians for many, many years. I would just kind of chuckle to myself and think, yeah, that's really going to happen. That's a likely story. But over the years, a few things have happened, and I've had an opportunity to reflect on this text a little bit, and I finally took another look at it and had to really begin to focus on some of the real intent there. And one of the things that gave me an opportunity to really evaluate this text in a new way, to come to a new understanding of what it was. And this kind of just flies right by you when you read it the first time. But it's the very last 2 words in the very last sentence. It says, I want you to be united in the same mind and the same purpose. Now, I don't know if you recognize it or not, but the same purpose is singular. It's not plural. Paul didn't ask them to be in the same mind about everything. Paul asked them to be in the same mind with the same purpose, singularly. You see, when we read that text, it's very easy to think that Paul's asking the church to simply get along and to have no divisions among them, and everybody think exactly the same way about everything, because that's kind of what it says. Unless you look really carefully, you miss this item that is of a singular nature. In other words, find that one thing where you can come together and you can function as one single body and have the same mind and the same purpose singularly. Just one thing. And when we begin to think about the text in that way, of that single-mindedness, that single purpose, all of a sudden it seems like, well, maybe this is possible. Maybe we can do that. Because certainly there is one thing that everybody can agree on. So I got to thinking some more about that. And I have a visual aid here because I knew that you wouldn't be able to see these. So I put them up on the screen. And I know some of you probably know what this is. Many of you may not. But this is a door wedge. They're made out of wood. And if you look at it carefully, you can see that this end is almost paper thin. And then they get thicker and thicker to where they're about 1/4 of an inch or so thick on the other end. And unbelievably, this door wedge got me thinking about this particular text. Because this door wedge is used for a certain very specific thing. And what that thing is that when you are installing a door, has anybody ever had to live with a door that didn't fit quite right? You know, you have a, yeah, I'm getting a little bit of a response there. You know, there's a closet door or a bathroom door that, you know, it doesn't close all the way, or you close it and it gets stuck and you can't open it. And the reason for all of those problems with those doors is because a door has a door frame, and the frame is attached to the walls. And the door has to be able to fit and swing inside of that door frame. And when you're installing a door, you can look and see how the door frame is aligning with the door. And sometimes you need to adjust the door frame a little bit. You need to push it in or push it out or something. And so you can take this door wedge and you can slip it in, and you can push that door frame into perfect alignment with your door. Now there's something else, though, that you need to know about these door wedges, and that is that obviously they're shaped in the shape of a wedge, like that. And if you put this flat against the wall, for example, then the door frame isn't going to lie flat against the wedge. It's going to be at a little bit of an angle. And so the only way to really use a door wedge properly is to use 2 of them. So you take 2 door wedges, and you have the narrow end here and the thick end here, and you take the second door wedge, and you have the narrow end here and the thick end here, and you put them together like this. Now they lie flat. They can be flat against the wall and flat against the door frame. And you slide them back and forth, and you can adjust the thickness. Now we're going to attach a metaphor to these door wedges. I won't fill in the blanks necessarily for you, but you'll get the idea. Because if you look at this door wedge, this one that I'm holding up, at least from my perspective, it is thin on the left and it's thick on the right. And the other one is thick on the left and thin on the right. You might say that this wedge leans right and this wedge leans left. So they are 2 different wedges. But yet when they come together with no distance between them, no division between them, they fit together perfectly for the single purpose of aligning a door frame to the door so that the door swings freely and closes properly. They rely on each other's differences in order to come together and form what is a perfect problem solver. So another thing that has been part of my experience with the door wedges and kind of re-evaluating this text and trying to think in terms of how is it that what was Paul's expectation of that church in Corinth? How could he possibly think that everybody could come together? Well, one of the things that we looked at annual conference this summer when we were there was this book. It's called The Anatomy of Peace. And in this book, there's multiple encounters and stories about a particular group of people that came together, and they were very, very different from each other. Different perspectives, different political alignments, different faith traditions in some cases. They were very, very different. And this book explains part of the process that they went through in order to allow themselves to really get to know each other, in order to begin to view each individual as an actual person rather than an obstacle, or somebody that needs to be converted, or somebody that needs to be persuaded to think like they do. In other words, to be able to honor that person as a person rather than somebody that was some sort of a lunatic. Now, the quote, "It is difficult to hate someone once you know their story," is attributed to a number of different people. Fred Rogers, or Mr. Rogers, is just one of those persons. I've heard it attributed to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I've heard it attributed to the Dalai Lama, to Mother Teresa, to Mahatma Gandhi. So it's out there, okay? But the message is still the same, that it is difficult to hate someone once you know their story. And the process that is kind of outlined in this book, The Anatomy of Peace, is a process of where people have that opportunity to really learn someone else's story. Now, the problem sometimes with the church is that we don't really have that opportunity to learn each other's story all that much. You know, there's you learned as a little kid, you're supposed to stay quiet in church, right? And you don't talk to each other. And this conversation that we're having right now is kind of just a one-way conversation. And so it's difficult to learn each other's stories in this context. And that's why we have other opportunities to do that. And part of that opportunity is when we gather together and do things like the luau that's coming up. Or we have coffee fellowship after service every week back in the fellowship hall. And these are the opportunities that we have to really learn each other's story and to talk about our perspective and to talk about our childhood, or to talk about what part of the country we were raised in, and to talk about all of these things that influence us and give us a certain perspective. Now, there is a process. There's things that begin to happen to you as you get to know somebody. And the first thing that begins to happen is you suddenly realize that all of these problems that you thought you had, particularly with an individual or with an institution or whatever, those problems begin to be transformed into opportunities. You think, well, I really can work with this person. I really do have that opportunity to get to know someone better. And then the next thing that happens is people that you despise, people that you would call an enemy, people that you would just not associate yourself with, people that are just foreign in every way, enemies are transformed into allies. Now, if you read the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, you'll understand that Jesus did this constantly. Taking people that were the enemy of the state, people that were the enemy of the culture, people that were the enemy of whatever popular thing was going on at the time, and he aligned himself with those persons. And the enemies of the society became the allies of Jesus, because he bothered to understand them. He bothered to understand their story. He got to know them. The third thing then that happens is conflict is transformed into celebration. We don't have a follow-up letter from the church in Corinth that outlines, exactly how the church in Corinth overcame all of their disagreements and all of their conflict. And did they survive? Well, yes, obviously they survived. And my hint is that there is some kind of celebration in there as they brought together all of those persons who thought differently, and they became a like mind with a same singular purpose. And they pursued that singular purpose together. And when they accomplished that goal, there was a great celebration that ensued. And finally, then, you begin to recognize that our differences, those differences of opinion, those different perspectives, those things that we thought were a wedge to drive us apart, is not a wedge at all, because it lines up perfectly with somebody else's differences. And when you are together and there's no division among you, you have the desired diversity present. Desired diversity, where it works for you and not against you. Because a single wedge by itself is of little value. Doesn't really work all that well for its intended purpose. It's only when you put another wedge with it that has an opposite orientation do they come together with no division between them, functioning perfectly for a single purpose and a single mind. So we have that opportunity to come together in unity and in story and in faith tradition. We have those opportunities that arise every so often. I would encourage everybody to, stay for the coffee fellowship after church. Find somebody you don't know very well and talk to them. Be sure and come to the luau on Saturday. And maybe some people from the neighborhood are going to show up that have never been to this church, and we can get to know them. But in all things, remember that we have a united purpose. We have a singular purpose in this church of outreach and ministry to this community. And we can all agree on that. Even when we seem like we are at opposite ends of the spectrum, we come together like those door wedges. And that desired diversity works for us and not against us. And that, of course, is food for thought. Amen.